Well, of course, as we've been many weeks now studying the book of Revelation, we are well into the book. And we are dealing with those things that are yet future. In fact, in chapter 7, the church is already in heaven. The church has been in heaven for a couple years or so. We've been raptured. That's the word we use when Jesus comes to take us home. And the tribulation has begun on the earth. Now, the tribulation is this 7-year period during which God is going to be dealing with the nation of Israel, and during which God is also going to be pouring out His wrath on this Christ-rejecting world. And so, as we've been many weeks in the 6th chapter, we began studying the events that will take place, one after the other, during the first half of the tribulation. And we're still in the first half of the tribulation. We're still studying those things that take place during the first 3.5 years. But in chapter 6, we began looking at the 7 seals. And so by way of review, Jesus, in chapter 5, as we saw the church in heaven after the rapture, took from the Father a scroll that was sealed with 7 seals. We'll be talking about a seal a little bit later in our study tonight. But He took this scroll, and we understood that that scroll was the title deed to the earth, and that Jesus took it because it's rightfully His. God created the earth, so it was His by right of creation. He gave dominion over the earth to man, who surrendered it to Satan when he disobeyed and sinned in the garden. But Jesus won all of that back at Calvary. And so in the heavenly scene, we see Jesus taking the scroll from the Father and beginning to open it. To open it, He would have to break each of the 7 seals. First one and then another until all 7 had been broken. And so the first 4 seals are also known as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And if you were here, you recall that in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we saw that the first seal was a white horse. And I believe that the rider of that horse is the Antichrist, and that we see the Antichrist coming to his position of prominence and power at the beginning of the tribulation. Then the second seal in verses 3 and 4 was the red horse, and the red horse represented war. Though the tribulation will begin under the auspices of peace, it very quickly will deteriorate into war and rumors of war all over the world. And then the third seal in verses 5 and 6 was the black horse. We learned that this represents famine and even the condition of inflation that many times goes hand in hand with it and is sometimes the cause of it. And then we saw the fourth seal in verses 7 and 8. This was the pale horse. We talked about the fact that it represented pestilence, disease that would be claiming lives all over the world. And as we continued, leaving the horsemen behind, but continuing with the seals, we studied the fifth seal in verses 9 through 11, and it had to do with the tribulation martyrs. Those who would receive Christ after the tribulation began, and we'll talk some more about that tonight too, but who would be killed for their faith in Christ. And then we came to the sixth seal last week, verses 12 through 17, in which we read about these cosmic disturbances. We talked about earthquakes and about asteroid or large meteorite showers and many of the things that would go along with that as part of that sixth seal. Now, as we come to chapter 7, one might expect that right away we would get the seventh and final seal. But in fact, we don't. We don't find the seventh seal until we get to chapter 8, verse 1. And so chapter 7 is somewhat parenthetical. As you read the chapter, it doesn't necessarily advance the narrative. And there are different points of view about that, which we'll get to in just a moment. But it is worth pointing out that there is a similar parenthesis between the sixth and seventh trumpets. Now again, by way of review, in the book of Revelation, you have 3 sets of 7 judgments. You have the 7 seals, then you have the 7 trumpets, and then you have the 7 bowls. The 7 trumpets come out of the 7th seal. The 7 bowls come out of the 7th trumpet. So you understand that what I'm talking about when I say that just like there is this parenthesis between the 6th and 7th seal, so too there is a parenthesis between the 6th and 7th trumpet. But as we look at this 7th chapter then, this parentheses, if you will, in verses 1 through 8 we get one group of tribulation saints. And in verses 9 through 17 we get another group. I said just a moment ago that after the rapture of the church there will be people getting saved. When the rapture happens, for some short period of time there will be exactly 0 Christians on the earth. Because I believe that everyone who has trusted Christ for salvation will be taken in the rapture. But sometime soon thereafter, people will begin to open their hearts to the Lord. And we talked about the possibility that people you and I have witnessed to, our friends, perhaps even family members, who have rejected Christ up until now, but they understand what we've said about the fact that Jesus at a point in time is going to come for the church, and that millions of people are going to disappear all at once. When that happens, some of those people will at that time open their heart and receive Christ. And in fact, many people around the world are going to receive Him. Verses 1 through 8 deals then with one major group of people like that. And this particular group is made up of Jewish believers. We'll add a lot of definition to that in a moment. And then in verses 9 through 17, we talk about Gentile believers, and we follow up to some degree on what we learned under the 5th seal in chapter 6, verses 9 through 11. Well, let's look at the first verse of this 7th chapter. We hope to cover 8 verses tonight. Verse 1 says, "After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree." Now this phrase, "after these things," is important. We talked about the fact that the 7th chapter doesn't necessarily advance the narrative of the book of Revelation. Up until now, things have been very chronological. But there are those who believe that this 7th chapter is not chronological, that its events do not follow the events of the 6th chapter and precede the events of the 7th chapter or the 8th chapter, but that its events take place throughout the first half of the tribulation, or in some points of view, throughout the entire tribulation. There's some merit to that view in that there are things about the information presented in this chapter that do look back and that do look forward. But it is also possible that it is at least somewhat chronological. Certainly the Greek would indicate that. The phrase "after these things" seems to indicate that throughout the book. At the very least, it means that whatever was revealed in this chapter was revealed after the things that were revealed and recorded in the 6th chapter. But it may also mean that what we're going to be reading about as we get to verse 2, 3, and 4, the instructions that are given to these angels, that it does in fact happen after the 6th seal, and that it precedes the opening of the 7th seal and the trumpets that follow. So it's interesting. And especially when you consider that the 4 angels that we're going to be talking more about may very well correspond with the first 4 trumpets. Remember how the first 4 seals were unique from the following 3 in that they were the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And the first 4 trumpets are all found there in the 8th chapter and do seem to relate in a way that you'll see in just a little while to these 4 angels. But it is worth pausing to talk a little bit about angels. You may not know that there are nearly 300 references to angels throughout the Bible. And we find them from one end of the Bible to the other. We find references from Genesis to Revelation. In fact, we find references to angels in every major part of the Scriptures. When we talk about the Old Testament, we find references to angels in the historic books, in the poetic books, and in the prophetic books. When you talk about the New Testament, we see references to angels in the Gospels, and in the Acts, and then again in the epistles. When you come to the book of Revelation, it's no exception, as you've seen in our text tonight. In fact, there are at least 65 clear references to angels in the book of Revelation. And that's not even counting the use of the word where it may well refer to pastors. We find that near the end of chapter 1 and throughout chapters 2 and 3. It is not counting those references. So that would make it even higher if those references are to actual angels. Well, when we talk about angels, and of course we could do a whole study or even a whole series on angels and on the spirit world, but I'll just relate a couple of things to you tonight. The angels were created by God. In fact, they were created by God the Son. The Bible tells us that Jesus created everything, that there's nothing that was created that He didn't create. So Jesus created the angels. And we gather from everything we read about the angels that they began in what we might refer to as a probationary period. And that at a point in time they were tested. And that afterwards they were confirmed as being either elect or evil, to use words that are applied to them in the Scriptures. If you'll hold your finger here and turn to Revelation chapter 12, I want to point out a couple of verses to you. These elect angels we continue to refer to as angels. The evil angels we usually refer to as fallen angels or as demons. We refer to them as fallen angels because they fell from their place in heaven along with Satan. Here in verse 12, if you look first, chapter 12 that is, if you look first at verse 9, it says that the great dragon, a reference to Satan, was cast out. That serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, he was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now, if you look back at verse 4, it tells us that his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And so this is where we get the idea that when Satan fell, he took some of the angels with him, and that in fact he took 1/3 of the angels with him. We don't know exactly how many angels there are, but he took 1/3. That means 2/3 are still serving God. Only 1/3 went with Satan. But then in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, it gives us a glimpse, if you will, at the role of angels in my life and in yours today, because there it tells us that angels are ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation. And so these elect angels, these ministering spirits, are actually working for your good and for mine. They are working on God's behalf to bring about God's will in our lives, to protect us when we need protection and things of that nature. So what an exciting thing it is to know that there really are angels and that they really are a part of our lives. Why do I believe in angels? Because the Bible says so. That's all the reason I need. But perhaps you can think of a time in your life when God has miraculously done something for you that perhaps angels were instrumental in. Well, so it talks about angels then, and specifically it talks about 4 particular angels, and it even tells us that these angels were standing at the 4 corners of the earth. Now, critics have been taking pot shots at the Bible as a result of the language for years. They claim that based upon this verse, the Bible is pre-scientific and its authors were flat earthers. That obviously the Apostle John believed in a flat earth and that the Bible is scientifically incorrect. Well, it should be pointed out that the Bible speaks in several places about the earth not as being flat, but as being a sphere. I'll quote some of these passages for you. Job 26, verse 10, it says, He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters, at the boundary of light and darkness. In Proverbs chapter 8, verse 27, it said, When He prepared the heavens, I was there, when He drew a circle on the face of the deep. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, we saw this passage earlier this year when we overviewed the book of Isaiah. It reads, It is He who sits above the circle of the earth. So the Scriptures talk about the earth as being a sphere. Some years ago, the U.S. Marine Corps, in one of their promotional ads, claimed that our Marines were in the 4 corners of the world. Now, I seriously doubt that the United States Marine Corps would appreciate the suggestion that they are pre-scientific or that they're a bunch of flat earthers. Obviously, it's a figure of speech. Corners, the word translated corners, could also be translated quarters. We might best think of it as the 4 compass points, north, east, south, and west, particularly in relationship to the wind. Because it says the 4 angels were standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth. So we're talking about the north wind, the east wind, the south wind, and the west wind. You might compare the references in the book of Daniel that speak of the four winds. Chapter 7, verse 2. Chapter 8, verse 8. Chapter 11, verse 4. All speak of the four winds. Well, as we talk about wind, there are over 120 references to wind in the Bible. More than 90 references in the Old Testament. More than 30 references in the New Testament. More than half of these references are said to refer in some way to the sovereignty and the power of God. Oftentimes they're actually used as a symbol of judgment. Certainly when we talk about the tribulation, we're talking about judgment. We're talking about God's judgment. So we have the four angels in the four corners holding the four winds. It says that they're being held that they might not blow. Henry Morris pictures this scene this way, as there being an angel at, both poles, and then an angel also at opposite ends of the equator. And they're holding the wind. This Greek word that's translated holding is an interesting one. It means to have in one's power, to be master of. That is, to hold fast and not to let go. So we could say that they will be controlling the atmospheric circulation. Just this year and in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk in the media and in the press about the freakish weather all over the country and even in other parts of the world. Many scientists have observed what they feel are rather dramatic changes in the weather patterns of the earth. But that isn't as new as you might suspect. U.S. News and World Report spoke to this issue some 25 years ago, and I thought it was worth noting that when they did that, in their June 11th issue, 1973, they said this, that officials at the National Weather Service put much of the blame for odd weather on shifts in the capricious jet streams that flow through the upper atmosphere. So there was this reference to these freakish weather patterns as being related to the jet streams. Here we see the angels controlling the atmospheric circulation. We understand, of course, just what can happen when wind gets out of control. We might think of what happened just over a year ago in Gerald, Texas. Or if you've been watching the news, we might think of what Hurricane Mitch has managed to do and those parts of the world that have been destroyed. A lot of the destruction done by wind. But in this case, the wind is being held that it should not blow. That's an amazing thought. There's times when it's windy and it's kind of irritating, If you leave the house and it's windy, you know you're in for a bad hair day. There's basically no way around it. And the wind can be rather bothersome. People who live in extremely windy cities can get pretty tired of it, complain about it. What if there were no wind? How about those summer days in Texas when it's so hot and it's so humid, you would give anything for a fly to flap its wing next to your face? Anything to get a little bit of circulation. What if you had to endure one entire Texas summer, or 2 or 3, where the wind never blew? There was never, ever a breeze. No relief. That'd be something. Last week I talked about the fact that I am from the smog capital of the world, San Bernardino. That's my hometown. I was born there, spent a good number of years there. And San Bernardino is so smoggy because it sits in a basin. San Bernardino doesn't produce most of its own smog. It probably produces a very, very small percentage of it. What happens, though, is that all the smog that's produced in Los Angeles and really all throughout Los Angeles County and all, it's blown inland until it settles into the basin that San Bernardino sits in. And when the smog rolls in, pretty soon it's almost suffocating. I think I mentioned last week the fact that there we were in a town that is right there at the foot of the San Bernardino Mountains. When Andrea and I first got married, we had an apartment that faced the mountains. And we were just a very, very short distance from the beginning of the foothills that led up to the mountains. But on extremely smoggy days, you could stand on our porch and you would not know that there were mountains there. If you'd never been in San Bernardino and you came in at night, you slept, you got up in the morning, you walked out into our porch, You wouldn't know there was a mountain range right there. That's how bad the smog is. All you see is this solid gray-brown color. Unbelievable. I remember the last day that we lived in San Bernardino. It was a Sunday. On Monday, my uncle and I, one of my uncles, would be leaving California in a U-Haul with all of Andrea's and my stuff, headed for Austin, and she'd be flying out a couple days later to meet us here in Austin. So that Sunday afternoon, between morning and evening services, that evening service was to be our farewell service there, having been on the staff there a couple of years. So that afternoon, we spent the whole day loading up that U-Haul, and it was a smoggy day. And I remember at the end of the day, and if you've lived in California or even spent much time there, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You can't breathe without wheezing. You deliberately have to choose to breathe shallow breaths, because if you take a deep breath, it's painful, and you will involuntarily begin to cough. So you deliberately have very shallow breathing. You have to breathe rapidly to get enough oxygen. It's terrible. I remember just thanking God when I got to Austin. Clean air. They talk about ozone days in Austin, and I'm like, ozone days? You guys don't even know what smog is. You want smog? I'll show you smog. Put your face right in front of your muffler and breathe deep. So my hometown smells like. That's smog. But here's the thing. You're wondering, where in the world is he going with this? The only thing that would ever provide any relief was when the Santa Anas began to blow. And the Santa Ana winds would come in from the desert. All of that smog would be blown out of the basin, and we didn't care how windy it was. It was so wonderful to see the mountains. Those first-time visitors startled to realize that there were mountains there. And to breathe clean air and not to feel that pain in your chest. Wow, what if you lived in San Bernardino and there was no wind for a year or 2 or 3 years? Oh man, it's scary to even think about. Well, not only would this impact happen, but it would interrupt the hydrologic cycle. When we get to chapter 11, verse 6, and we begin learning about these two witnesses, we discover that there's no rain on the earth for 3.5 years, 42 months. And if you understand the hydrologic cycle, you know that you've got to have wind. You've got to have this atmospheric circulation for the water that's evaporating to be moved to where the rain needs to fall. So it would result, obviously, in drought conditions, and could, to the extent that this passage looks back and forth, be instrumental in the famine that we saw as part of the seals in chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. So then we're thinking about all of this. We come to verses 2 and 3. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. So we have this reference to another angel. Now, some say that this is actually Jesus himself. It's the opinion of some. He isn't identified as such here. It simply says another angel. And it says that this angel has the seal of the living God. Remember I said we would talk a little bit more about a seal? When we talked about the scroll with the 7 seals, we were speaking more or less of the result of using a seal. But here we're talking about the seal itself. Seal is a portable instrument used to stamp a document or another article. If you were here Sunday evening as we continued our overview of Jeremiah, you remember that in chapter 32, God told Jeremiah to buy a field. When he bought the field, there was a title deed made up for it, and it was rolled up. It would have been tied off with a piece of string. Then clay would have been placed over the string, and Jeremiah would have taken his seal, perhaps even a signet ring, and he would have stamped it. He would have made the impression on the clay that would identify the deed as belonging to him, the land that the deed represented as belonging to him. These seals had the same legal validity as an actual signature. Without it, no document was considered authentic. So when we talk about a seal, we're talking about the mark of authenticity, the mark of ownership, even of protection. All of that's very interesting when you talk about the way the Holy Spirit seals believers, but that's another subject. Now in chapter 9, verse 4, you might just flip over to it because it's only a page turn or maybe 2, depending on your Bible. But in chapter 9, verse 4, when it speaks about the fifth trumpet, there's an interesting reference. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth or any green thing or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So we're going to read more about this seal. You're going to learn more about it in just a moment. But you see then that there is an emphasis upon the protection that was afforded the recipient of this particular seal. So back in chapter 7, in verse 2, notice the reference there to the fact that these angels had been granted to harm the earth and the sea. Verse 3 repeats this. It repeats the word earth and the word sea, and then it adds the word or the trees. And so I'll make the point again, but I'll make it with a little bit more detail now, that we see the possible relationship between these four angels and the first four trumpets. Because in chapter 8, in the first trumpet, the vegetation is struck. So we might think of that as the earth. In the second and third trumpets, the seas are struck and the waters are struck. And then in the fourth trumpet, the heavens are struck. So you see the potential relationship there. But they're told not to harm. Verse 3, do not harm these things until we've done, until I've accomplished what I've been sent to do. So there's this brief pause. It's kind of like the calm before the storm. Or maybe more accurately, like the eye of the storm, because they've already experienced some storm. But there's this break. Like the eye is passing over, but like there is more yet to come, and even the worst yet to come. Last week I reminded you that Jesus, in talking about the signs of the second coming in Matthew chapter 24, said the exact same things that we read about in chapter 6 as the first 6 seals. And He added, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Last week we suggested that we might translate that, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get worse. And so there is just this momentary pause, this momentary break. But the time we get to chapter 8, verse 7, and we get to that first trumpet, you're going to see that the eye of the storm has passed, and that the storm is going to begin to rage once again. Well, we're told then in this third verse that the angel is going to seal the servants, and that this is going to take place on their forehead. Now, there is an interesting point to be made about the fact that they're called servants. It's that word, doulos, that's used of a bond slave so frequently in the New Testament. But if you'll turn back for just a moment to chapter 1, verse 1. It's been many, many weeks since we saw this. This book begins with these words, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave Him to show His servants things which must shortly take place, that He sent and signified it by His angel to His servant John. Did you notice? To show His servants. It's the same Greek word, doulos. And so turning back to chapter 7, it has been suggested that whoever these individuals are in the 7th chapter, and we'll answer that question shortly, that God is going to give them insight and understanding into the book of Revelation, that the book of Revelation was given for the servants, and that they certainly are among them. They're identified as such here. That as God begins to work in their life, and as God prepares to use them in a mighty way that we'll touch on when we close tonight, that one of the things that they'll have at their disposal is a working knowledge of the book of Revelation. That they'll be able to use that knowledge to clearly share with people what it is that God is doing, and to call them to repentance and to faith. Well, another thing that's interesting about this is that they're going to receive this seal in their forehead. Look at Revelation chapter 22 for a moment. In chapter 22, we're moving way into the future. After the second coming. After Christ's 1,000-year reign here on earth that we call the millennium. After even the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. Then it says in chapter 22, beginning in verse 3, there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and His servants shall serve Him. They shall see His face, and His name shall be on their foreheads. And so just like here in chapter 7, it talks about this seal being placed upon this select group. By the time we get to chapter 22 and we're talking about eternity future, it speaks of this seal being His name and being on all of our foreheads. Now, look also then at chapter 13. This is something that you've heard about before and are familiar with. But in verse 16, it says that He, the Antichrist, causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, obviously, we're going to study that when we get there. It's probably going to be a while, at the rate we're going. But we will get there, and we will talk about that. The point I want to make tonight is simple, and that is that Satan has proven over and over again to be a counterfeiter. And Satan never does anything that's original. Satan's never created anything. He's never originated anything. All he can do is copy, counterfeit, imitate. And he's going to do the very same thing in this particular case. Oftentimes we talk about the mark of the beast, but one thing that we don't often talk about is the fact that it is one more example of Satan counterfeiting something that God is actually planning to do in a very, very different way. Making something wonderful wicked with his counterfeit. And so, back in chapter 7 then, in verse 4. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. 144,000. So this group that we're talking about in these first 8 verses consists of 144,000 people. Now, sometimes the best way to understand what something is to understand what it's not. The 144,000 are not the Jehovah's Witnesses. You know, you can spot a JW a mile away because they carry those little comic books with the goofiest cartoons you've ever seen. I don't know who draws those things, but they all look exactly the same. Goofy. And I know them the minute I see them. You open the door, and before you even see their face or their New World Translation, you see their comics. You know what, though? Many of the Jehovah's Witnesses believed for years that they would be the 144,000. Then they ran into a little problem. Their membership exceeded that number. So they had to modify their theology a little bit. And now only the best of the best, make the 144,000. The rest just spend eternity here on earth. Oh, joy, joy, joy. I remember a guy witnessing to me. I lived in Hollywood, in California, for like a year and a half. And this guy worked where I worked. And I didn't know anything about him. He was one of a bunch of people that worked there. I really didn't know him. And our breaks changed so that we had a break at the same time. And this guy started talking with me every day. And each day he'd talk with me just on a little bit more personal level, And he kept kind of driving the conversation toward discontentment. Like, isn't it a drag? We've got to work every day. And, your whole life is working. And, yeah, that's kind of a drag. That's kind of a bummer. And little did I know, then all of a sudden one day he springs it on me. A book with a goofy cartoon on the front of it. You can live forever here on earth. And that was the whole idea, become a JW and spend forever on this rotten ball of rock, that God's going to totally refurbish and make awesome for the millennium, and then He's going to waste it and create a new heaven and a new earth anyway. It's not the Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm sorry to say. Actually, I'm not sorry to say. It's not the Mormon elders either. Nor is it the former followers of Herbert W. Armstrong and the Worldwide Church of God. Now, perhaps you know that in the last couple of years, the Worldwide Church of God has made great strides toward orthodoxy, but for a long, long time, it was a cult group. Herbert W. Armstrong was their ringleader. He taught much the same thing. In fact, the surest way to become one of the 144,000 was to double or triple your tithe to the Worldwide Church of God. How convenient. The 144,000 also will not be Sabbath-keeping Seventh-day Adventists, as some of them believe. That when Jesus returns, it will be those Adventists that are observing the Sabbath that will make up the 144,000. You might ask your Jehovah's Witness at the door, or your Mormon elder at the door, or perhaps your Seventh-day Adventist friend which tribe they're from. Because it makes it very clear here that these individuals are of all the tribes of the children of Israel. Now, usually when you hold false teaching and what the Bible clearly says contradicts it, then you've got to, muddy things up by trying to spiritualize what is obviously intended to be understood for exactly what it says. Even in the book of Revelation, there's so much that it says what it means what it says. And it's not that confusing. 144,000 means just that. 144,000. Studied all week to figure that out. And of all the tribes of the children of Israel, of all the tribes of the children of Israel. And they're going to be named for us in the following verses, which we'll run through quickly before saving a little bit of time to summarize and talk more about the 144,000 themselves. But clearly, these individuals are Jews. Paul wrote to the Romans in chapter 11, verse 25, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." It seems like every time Paul said that he didn't want us to be ignorant about a particular thing, and he said that several times, that those are the things that there's the most ignorance about today. He didn't want his readers to be ignorant about spiritual gifts. There's a great deal of ignorance about that. And he didn't want his readers to be ignorant about the rapture of the church. There's a great deal of ignorance about that. And he didn't want his readers to be ignorant regarding God's plan for the nation of Israel. There's a great deal of ignorance about that too. But this blindness in part won't be forever. And there's going to be that time when many Jewish people are going to be saved and are going to receive Christ. Now, we talk about the 144,000. That doesn't mean that no Gentiles will be saved. They will be saved, but they won't receive this seal. And it's not to say that only 144,000 Jewish people will be saved. We would expect there would be more than that. But only 144,000 receive this seal. Let's look at verses 5 through 8 before we come back to verse 4 at the end. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Reuben, 12,000. Gad, 12,000. Verse 6, Asher, 12,000. Naphtali, 12,000. Manasseh, 12,000. Verse 7, Simeon, 12,000. Levi, 12,000. Issachar, 12,000. Verse 8, Zebulun, 12,000. Joseph, 12,000. And of the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. Now it's been counted that there are 29 lists of the tribes in the Bible. Usually, the tribe of Levi is omitted, which leaves you with 11. And then Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, are inserted in place of Joseph. So you've got 11 minus 1 is 10, plus 2 is 12. So you understand what I'm saying? Levi and Joseph don't normally appear, but Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, do. That's usually, not all the time, but usually. That becomes important as we go through the list in a moment. But it's also worth pointing out the significance of the tribes in relationship to the millennial reign of Christ and also in relationship to eternity future. You see, the names of the 12 tribes appear on the gates of millennial Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem during the millennium. The names of the 12 tribes appear on the gates. You can reference Ezekiel 48:31. And then in Revelation 21:12, we learn that such is also the case for the new Jerusalem, the eternal Jerusalem. When you have the new heaven and the new earth, the eternal state, you have the new Jerusalem, and again, the names of the 12 tribes appear on the 12 gates. We're then told that the names of the 12 apostles appear on the foundations. So very interesting. Well, then in verse 5, we get Judah, Reuben, and Gad. You would expect, I suppose, that the first tribe mentioned would be the firstborn. Would make sense, but it's not. Judah was the fourth son of Jacob. The sons of Jacob were born to him by 4 different women, 2 wives and 2 handmaids. And so Judah was the son of Leah. And Judah's name means praise. Judah was given the scepter in Genesis chapter 49. Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so Judah was raised to a place of prominence. Well, then you have Reuben. And Reuben was the first son of Jacob. His mother also was Leah. But Reuben forfeited his position, his prominence as firstborn when he fell into sin. He got involved in sexual immorality, and as a result of that, he lost his place as firstborn. His name means "see a son." And then in verse 5 we also get Gad. Now Gad was the seventh son of Jacob. His mother was Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, and his name means troop. In verse 6 we get Asher, Naphtali, and Manasseh. Asher was the eighth son of Jacob. His mother also was Zilpah. His name means gladness. Naphtali was the sixth son of Jacob. His mother was Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. His name means wrestling. And then Manasseh is Jacob's grandson, and the first son of Joseph. So we'll talk more about Joseph in a moment. But again, Joseph's sons were Ephraim and Manasseh, and some would even say that Jacob had adopted them as sons. Manasseh means causing to forget. Now in verse 7 we get Simeon, Levi, and Issachar. Now Simeon was the second son of Jacob. His mother was Leah. His name means hearing. Levi was the third son of Jacob. And the thing that's interesting about Levi is that he's the priestly tribe. It's the Levites who are given the priestly responsibilities. But it's also interesting that Levi takes Dan's place in the list. Dan is omitted. Why is Dan omitted? Probably because of idolatry. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment when we talk about why Ephraim is omitted. Some people speculate that either the Antichrist or the false prophet will come from the tribe of Dan. It's purely speculative. There are reasons not to believe that. Some people think that's why it's omitted. I'm more inclined to say that they're omitted because of idolatry. And again, we'll revisit that in a moment. But then you have, by the way, Levi's name means joined. And then you have Issachar, who was the ninth son of Jacob. His mother was Leah. And his name means he brings wages. In verse 8, you get Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Zebulun was the 10th son of Jacob. His mother was Leah. His name means dwelling. And then Joseph, normally omitted from the lists, but included here. The 11th son of Jacob, his mother was Rachel. Remember, Rachel was the one that Jacob truly loved. The one that he wanted to marry in the first place before he was tricked into marrying Leah. And his name means adding. Now, why then does Joseph take his son's Ephraim's place? Well, some say that it's just interchangeable. Just use Joseph instead of Ephraim. But I would say that there's more to it than that. You see, remember that Saul was the first king of Israel, of the United Kingdom, and then Saul was followed by David, and then David by his son Solomon. But after the death of Solomon, the kingdom was divided. 10 tribes of the north, 2 tribes of the south. The north known as Israel, the south known as Judah. And in the north, they immediately began to practice idolatry. And these idols were made. One was placed way up in the north in Dan. And the other was placed way to the south in Ephraim. And so you have a situation where these 2 tribes are the ones that were immediately associated with the idolatry of the northern kingdom. And we find their names omitted here. You know what's really cool about that, though? Is that when you get into the book of Ezekiel, I believe it's chapter 48. I don't have it here in my notes. When the land is being distributed in the millennium to the tribes, Dan is the first tribe to receive its inheritance. The grace of God. We see Dan omitted here, perhaps because of idolatry, but we see Dan not only included later, but first. Isn't that just like God? Isn't that just like what He's done in your life and mine? We don't deserve anything, and yet He's done so much for us. He's blessed us in so many ways. And then we see Benjamin. Now, Benjamin is the 12th son of Jacob, also the son of Rachel. His name means son of my right hand. Some have suggested that with the exception of Judah, obviously given the place of prominence, that the fact that when you see the list, it oftentimes does change in terms of the order or in terms of the tribes included or not included, that it just reminds us the way that God looks at us and the way that He doesn't play favorites, the way that each one of us is just as significant and just as important, just as special to Him. Well, returning then to verse 4 so that we can try and wrap things up in the next several minutes. We have these 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel who were sealed. When we get to chapter 14, we'll be studying the first 5 verses there that talk with a great deal more detail about the 144,000. We're really going to learn perhaps more about them there than we learn about them here. And I'll resist the temptation to try to draw from all of that tonight so that we can get it fresh when we get to the 14th chapter. But so make a mental note at least, if not a note in the margin of your Bible to cross-reference chapter 14, verses 1 through 5. But these individuals receive this seal on their forehead. It's associated with the name of God. It's clearly also associated with His protection. And so these 144,000 are going to be protected throughout the tribulation period. They'll live through the tribulation. And this suggests to us then that they will be among those who are alive at the second coming of Christ and who enter into the kingdom in their earthly bodies. We will have been raptured. We'll have received our new bodies at that time. When Jesus comes back in the second coming, there will be those alive upon the earth. And we read about the judgment of nations. In the judgment of nations in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus separates the sheep from the goats. And He talks about how that the sheep were those who treated His brethren a particular way. And the goats are those who failed to do that. It's very, very likely that the separation of the sheep and the goats has everything to do with how those alive upon the earth at the end of the tribulation treated the Jewish people, particularly the Jewish Christians, most particularly the 144,000, who we see standing with Christ in those opening verses of chapter 14. When you did it to the least of these my brethren, you did it unto me. And so those who treated them the right way were those who were saved and were evidencing God's work in their heart by the way they treated them. And those who failed to treat them that particular way are those who were not saved and who evidenced that by their failure to treat them a particular way. So you can check out Matthew chapter 25, the judgment of nations, the separation of the sheep and the goats. Why does God protect these 144,000 for this period of time? We believe that it is because these 144,000 are evangelists. That when we look next week at verses 9 through 17, that we are going to be talking to a great degree about the fruit of their ministry. Even as these 144,000 may, to a large degree, be the fruit of the 2 witnesses that we learn about in the 11th chapter. And so we have 144,000 Jewish evangelists, 144,000 Jewish Billy Grahams, if you will, who are going to be sharing the good news all over the world. Arnold Frutenbaum, who writes about so many Jewish issues, talks about what a perfect choice that is. I mean, even just thinking about it from a practical standpoint, the fact that you have Jewish people living in most places of the world. And that so many of the Jewish people are bilingual, some even multilingual. And the way that God could so easily use them, so many of the Jewish people, and certainly not all, and perhaps less in our country than in some other parts of the world, but so many of the Jewish people who have not recognized Jesus as the Messiah, they have not been saved yet, but they do have a foundation in the Scriptures. When these guys get saved, man, they are going to be stoked for God. They're going to be so on fire because they're going to have this knowledge and stuff that you and I spent years, we're still trying to figure this stuff out. They're going to have all this background and all this knowledge, and they're going to be able to just share in a powerful way about Jesus, the Messiah, and about God's plan and about what's going on. So in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus was talking about the last days and the signs of His coming, and we've referenced this before, Jesus talked about how that all the world would hear. All the world would hear before He came back. I'm not talking about the rapture of the church. There's nothing that's got to happen before Jesus comes for us. But the second coming And so these 144,000 Jewish evangelists will be one of the tools God will use to evangelize the whole world. Them, the two witnesses, and then later on we'll also learn about angels that are also part of that process. So, pretty exciting, all the things that God has in mind. Pretty cool to realize that even in the middle of judgment, God won't have forgotten mercy. God won't have forgotten grace. God will still be reaching out to individuals. He'll still be touching and changing people. Isn't that great? God's love is so awesome. Why not bask in it tonight? Could you use God's touch tonight? Could you use just a flood of His mercy, a flood of His grace? Well, it's flooding. You just need to lay back and enjoy the stream, you know. Let God encourage you tonight to know that He loves you, that He's working in your life, that He wants great things for you. There's nothing happening in your life but what He's allowing because it's part of His loving plan to make you all that He wants you to be. He hasn't forgotten you or abandoned you. But just like in the end times, He's got a plan for your times, yours and mine today. It should be so comforting and so reassuring. Let's have a word of prayer.